Hey, everybody. Quick updates on everything that's going on. We are finishing chapter 4 and stuff with infant mental health. And we also have a teaching demonstration on um, psychology professor we may hire. As you know, Intro to Psych is a demanded course out of all social workers. So they've asked to teach it in our class. So I am going to run that. In the meantime, getting through some more of the infant mental health. So field promotes healthy social and emotional development. The 0 to 3 diagnostic classification task force was started in '94. This task force defined mental health for infants as developing the capacity from birth to 3 in order to experience, regulate, and express emotions. And that's what the parents are there to help with. And also explore environment and learn the context of family, community, and cultural expectations for children. What is infant mental health? Infants are vulnerable to abuse and neglect, obviously, depending on how the parents are. They may withdraw from interactions and even seem to suffer depression. They can develop problems with feeding, sleeping, and behavioral regulation. We had a while, we actually had to switch over to formula and some pumping because our first and second child did not latch very well. They definitely do not sleep very well, and that does affect the parent's mental health. So, problems in infant parent relationship due to previous pregnancy loss, postpartum depression, infants' medical and developmental problems, parents' drug use, or abusive infant. Even prolonged separations, family stress, and parents' mental illness, or parent with their own long standing attachment disorder. And that's what we're going to kind of dip into here, this attachment stuff that goes on, which is important and shows ways that folks develop. So, infant mental health assessment and interventions, the aims are um, instrument for assessing emotional well-being for children from birth to 5 years old. We look at attachment and interaction, like social support, and then their mastery of attachment. Also, intervention for emotional development. If they show admiration for baby and parents present. So, as a social worker, we want to teach them how to work with their kids, point out parents' ability to hear the baby and child's cries, requests, and respond appropriately, discuss the role of other parents in caregiving, and discuss upcoming stages of infant development. And then comment on how proud the parent must be to see the baby and child doing well. Those are a lot of the things we would cover. Some of the early interventions for developmental delay. So until the '70s, when I was born, parents were encouraged to institutionalize babies with a developmental delay. There's a lot of videos on this, especially if you do a search for Geraldo Rivera. Um, those challenges that came up when he visited those things. Most communities now provide infant stimulation and early intervention programs. Like at Lighthouse Youth Services, we provided Help Me Grow. And parents are taught exercises and activities to do with the child at home. And then strengthening the baby's muscle enriches the interaction with their environment and enhances cognitive and physical development. So some of these biopsycho physical strengths and hazards, like an injury from an accident, illness susceptibility, sudden infant death syndrome, and parents will take preventative measures with that. So, um, breastfeeding, the World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, and then also shows how the antibodies are passed down from the mother. Even with COVID, especially lately, they said some of the COVID antibodies are passed. Long-term benefits against illness such as diabetes, leukemia, and high blood pressure. Less than 40% of babies aged 6 months or younger are exclusively breastfed internationally. So it has become a bit of a challenge. Maybe dehydration, maybe not a comfortable place to do it. So I'll stop there as we have a lot on sudden infant death syndrome and some of the stuff in Ohio and the Midwest. But I wanted to jump over to this teaching demonstration and get you guys started here because we're about a minute away and we'll see where they go from there. So I have a Zoom link. If let me see if that's working. I have a Zoom link. So because this is Teams, my class is on Zoom. I'll translate any questions that come about. It's called the class is Human Behavior and the Social Environment.
Wait, so it's your class?
I think so, unless if Sarah had
something. Why not just send us your Zoom link?
I thought that this was sent out to the whole faculty for.
You can still do it. I mean, it's just us.
So and to be honest, I usually have a pre-recorded, and they can access it later. And I have a feeling that that's what is going to happen. So more than likely, it won't benefit us either way.
Makes sense. Yeah, I'm happy to do whatever you all want me to.
Yeah,
it is a social work class, right?
Yeah, it's a social work class called Human Behavior in the Social Environment.
Well, can you tell us a little about what the course is about, so that way
Yeah.
help him?
Yeah, it's actually because I have a psychology degree in undergraduate. It's essentially developmental psychology.
Okay.
So, and we are on like birth and then infants at this point. So, I mean, you don't have to match up with that, but that's just where we are after conception, birth, infant, those first few years of development and how much the brain develops.
Oh man, to be honest with you, I have nothing developmental in this.
It's fine.
I'm just gonna jump straight into hard cognition.
We have so few summer courses. That's why I became the go-to for a lot of summer courses.
But I would add to that, it's not that we don't have a lot of classes, especially after pandemic. A lot of students went online. And so we're offering a large amount of classes, but they're all online, or the majority of them are online.
Right. And then even online ones, because of pandemic, it's kind of carried over where there's the film option and we film it and it saves a record of the class and then they can watch it later. And if they have COVID, they don't have to come in and do the class in person. So.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with, but we've been doing similar things over here. Even our in-person stuff is hybrid to some extent.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. Would you all like me to start off?
Sure.
All right. We introduced Nikita. Jonathan, since she's in the.
Oh yeah, did Nikita show up? Okay.
I see Sarah's there as well. Nikita.
Sarah, Nikita, and Genevieve. If any of them want to introduce themselves or fellow social work people, I can
introduce myself.
Yeah.
Hi. I am Professor Nikita Jackson. I am an assistant professor and field coordinator for the social work program. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. All right, awesome. Let me share my screen. I am much more familiar with Zoom than I am with Teams, but I'm feeling confident that this will go well. All right, there we go. So my name is Chris Sanders, and my goal today is to give you a thorough definition of cognitive psychology. We have 45 minutes to do this. And my main goal by the end of this 45 minutes is that you understand what cognitive psychology is. Now, I do also have a side goal of talking about cognition so much today that you actually find yourself using the term cognition in a conversation later on today. So I'll have to check with you later to see if I actually accomplished that. But this is a rather condensed discussion. This can, of course, be expanded out into a full course. If this were an introductory psychology course, then the discussion that I'm having with you today would probably occur over 2 or 3 sessions at least, because this is a pretty broad field. And then any of the subtopics that I cover in here can also be expanded out into their own courses and their own lectures. But today we're going to focus on cognitive psychology broadly. And once I can get my tech working, let's see. Okay. And so to talk about cognitive psychology, I'd first like to talk about the big umbrella term of psychology. Psychology is the study of human thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. All right. Cognitive psychology is specifically the study of our thoughts or our cognitions. It is the subdiscipline of psychology that specifically examines how we think. And our cognitions include all the processes, conscious and unconscious, that work together to form every thought in our heads and to make us who we are. Now, I'm going to outline several of these processes for you today. And along the way, we'll discuss some pretty amazing things that our minds can do, and then also some pretty silly things that our minds find themselves doing, silly mistakes that we seem to make over and over again. So just to begin, I want you to know that cognitive psychology is the branch of psychology that focuses on our thoughts, and another word for thoughts is cognitions. Here's an overview of where we'll go to from here. Next, we're going to talk about the cognitive revolution. So the emergence of cognitive psychology as a field caused quite a stir, actually. So we're going to discuss some of that history real quickly before we dive real deep into these cognitions or thoughts. First, we'll talk about reasoning and decision making. Then we'll follow that up by talking about attention and your attentional scope. And then lastly, we'll discuss memory and language. All of these things are deeply embedded in our thinking, and so they're part of cognition. To finish up, we'll talk about some obvious applications of cognitive psychology that we see in the world around us. That's in the therapy session or in the therapy setting, as well as in public policy and technology. Cognitive psychology has actually had a very broad reach, and when we start talking about these cognitions, you might see why. But these are the more obvious things that we can definitely point to and say that that was cognitive psychology that did that. And then finally, we'll just close out the discussion. So to begin, let's talk about the cognitive revolution. And so far, I've been talking about cognitive psychology. I haven't said that it's a basic science. And by that, I mean it's all about uncovering the basic properties of something. And in this case, it's the basic properties of how we think. The cognitive psychologist is a scientist, and they're a scientist who does not have motives outside of just understanding how humans think. Now, in the process of exploring the space and performing studies and analyzing reaction times and various different things, brain scans as well, we have come across a whole bunch of profound knowledge that's had some major implications for culture in general, but American culture especially. For this, I'd like to talk about psychology up until the 1960s and 1970s. So mostly post-World War I up until the 60s. And in this time, psychology was driven by a argument called strong behaviorism. To set this up for you, we have a lot of social scientists in the room today. So you probably feel like I do that sometimes our colleagues in what they like to call the harder sciences, physics or chemistry or biology, like to think of themselves as, they like to draw the line around science right around themselves. It's oftentimes that the social scientist is considered to be a pseudoscientist or not quite as serious as somebody who studies atoms. If you study people, then you can't quite be as serious of a scientist as these other types of scientists. And in the 1960s, psychologists were feeling this. They were feeling it strong. And so the entire science was driven by this notion that we are never going to speak about anything that we cannot observe directly. We are only going to talk about behavior. This is the strong behaviorist argument. It's to say that our job is not to speculate on what the animal could be thinking or feeling. Recall that psychology is about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We can only measure what the animal is doing as behavior. And so the whole science was about these Skinner box experiments and different things where we poke somebody and see how they react. We turn up the temperature and we see how they react. And we keep poking people and turning up the temperature until we have an equation for the number of pokes and the specific temperature at which people get frustrated. This is behaviorism. This is looking just at the behavior of the individual. There is nothing in these studies about why the animal is reacting the way that they are. There's no stipulation about what they might be feeling, about their anger or their discomfort, because those things are internal. That's not science. You can't study that directly. The cognitive revolution is when we broke away from that idea. Cognitive revolution is the idea that we can quantify and analyze so much more than just behavior. And by doing so, we can understand how the mind works. This idea that in addition to looking at the animal's behavior, we can ask the animal, humans in this case, how it's feeling. We can talk about the different thoughts that went through that person's mind. And in modern times, we can hook that person up to all sorts of brain imaging machinery and look at how those thoughts and those feelings manifest within the brain and how they impact other regions of the brain and lead to other things. None of this would be possible if we didn't take that small leap to start also thinking about thoughts and feelings. So I do know that many of my students have been born since the 1970s. And so it's really hard to paint this picture. And it is also really hard to overstate what kind of impact cognitive psychology had on first psychology as a field, but then also our culture as Americans. This changed the way that policymakers and everyone in general viewed humans. No longer is the view of a human completely colored by our views of other types of animals and the behaviors that they perform, we have a more holistic view of people now that also includes their various thoughts and feelings and everything that makes them them. So this expansion of our science led to all sorts of new treatments for depression, anxiety, and phobias, and other disorders. Also included within that is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the foremost leading treatment for most of these things. And then also major advancements were made in human testing and training because these cognitive psychologists are all about the ways that we think. We can now figure out ways to improve the ways that we think. And we also understand the limitations and the capabilities of the human brain much better. And so in addition to bridging that gap between the behaviorists and a more complete picture of the human, cognitive psychologists also bridge the gap between psychology and neuroscience, because this is the part of the field that started looking at things outside of just behavior. So that's all of our history lesson. Moving forward, we're going to be focusing on this term cognition again. We're going to jump back into cognition. And this is the earliest definition that was widely accepted across the discipline for the term cognition. And it refers to all processes by which the sensory input is transformed, reduced, elaborated, stored, recovered, and used. It is concerned with these processes even when they operate in the absence of relevant stimulation, as in images and hallucinations. Furthermore, although cognitive psychology is concerned with all human activity rather than some fraction of it, the concern is from a particular point of view. While other viewpoints are equally legitimate and necessary, the cognitive psychologist is interested in looking at cognitions, our thoughts and our thought patterns. At the start of this definition, we see that cognition is very broad. It's all processes by which an input is something inside of the human brain. It's easy to get lost in the words here, so let me draw this out real quick. We can assume that human being has somewhere in the range of 5 or 7 or 9 senses, depending upon who you ask. We have sight and smell and hearing, taste and feel. Those are the obvious ones. And we have different receptors on the outsides of our body for receiving this sensory input from our surrounding environment. We sense these things. So the term for these senses coming into our brain and becoming cognitions is sensation. Once we sense them, we need to make sense of them, adding some context so that we can engage in perception. This is when we actually give some sort of meaning to the sensory input that's coming in. Now, this information is now all in the conscious space, along with additional input from working memory and long-term memory. Here in this conscious space, we can form conscious thoughts and engage in processing or reasoning to make decisions. We can also pull up a happy memory and just play this happy memory whenever we like. This is another use for the conscious space. All of these things are cognition, and it is my pleasure to discuss with you today how all of this cognition works. One interesting thing is that cognitive psychology grew alongside the birth of computers, and cognitive psychologists played a large role in helping to understand the implications of artificial intelligence during those early years. For these reasons, and because the metaphors are awesome, Cognitive psychologists often use analogies from the computer to explain their concepts. So you'll hear some of these pop up in how I describe different ways that the brain is working. I'll try to keep them to a minimum though, because I know not everyone here is a computer geek like me. But these computer metaphors do have a usefulness in that people in the general public tend to understand these things, at least the ones that I'm going to use today. And so it makes it really easy to explain what's going on in the mind as we talk about these things. These metaphors and analogies, though, continued growing. So as the technology advanced and as cognitive psychology advanced, we've gotten to a point now where cognitive psychologists talk to each other in terms of neural networks. And these are the things that artificial intelligence uses to learn. So even their analogies within cognitive psychology have gotten to be rather advanced by this point, but we'll stick to the more simple ones. So I've gone through and I briefly just mentioned some of the key terms in cognitive psychology: sensation, perception, consciousness, processing, working memory, long-term memory. I realize that I have these on a face currently, and it is important for me to state that I'm not talking about any physical structures. The location of these words on this face has nothing to do with their location within the brain. What I'm actually talking about are a set of processes. And the locations where these processes occur overlap to some extent. You can see differences, though, in brain scans. But if you really want to get into the neural structures that are underlying these things, then cognitive neuroscience is a field that greatly overlaps with cognitive psychology, and it's the study of cognition at the physiological level. So once again, everything that occurs inside of this brain, once the sensory input has gotten in there, is called cognition. So we went through the overview, we've touched upon the history, and now we're starting to get into cognition itself. Of the things that we covered, I pointed towards reasoning and decision making that occurs in the conscious space, and it draws resources both from our perception and from our memory to make decisions. And we'll go into that more deeply next. Something that's important to note is that you cannot be distracted by more pressing concerns if you want to engage in real, thorough reasoning. You need the time and motivation to do so. But reasoning is required for us to solve complex problems, especially complex logical problems. And you're probably already aware of this. And if you think about how you yourself has made a decision in the past, you can probably think about your brain doing this. But what we do is we take our memories and our sensory input and we create premises. And we stack up a whole bunch of premises and we see the logical relationships between them and we make a decision based on that. A lot of this is occurring faster than the English language could talk about it. We think at that speed a lot of times. And so you could have simultaneously multiple premises being developed and being fit together so that you can reach a conclusion in the end. When we form those conclusions, we arrive at them using two different types of reasoning, deductive and inductive. So to draw out what I was just talking about, your conscious mind quickly, when it is solving problems, engages in this reasoning process. It takes your previous experiences, facts that you know about the world, your incoming perceptions. Recall that it is a sense, and then it is a sensation, and then we add context to it, and it becomes a perception. And your current mood. All of these things are being combined in different ways to form a series of different premises. In this case, I'm deciding whether or not I'm going to put on a jacket. And my mind is going to start throwing together all sorts of premises to help me make that decision. I'll think about how the weather has been, and it really has been nice over the past few days. And I'll think about whether anybody has said anything to me about storms. My own personal opinions about jackets are going to come into play. And my own personal opinions about being prepared for things are going to come into play. And these different statements can have different weights, and ultimately, my decision is going to be drawn from this information in some degree. And in the present case, it seems to me that I have more reasons to leave my jacket at home than I do to carry a jacket. Now, like I said before, most of these premises are formed faster than they can be spoken. So all of this takes place so fast that we're hardly aware of it sometimes. Other times, though, particularly when we are making important decisions, we deliberately slow down this process so that we can check all of our logic, verifying all of our facts, and draw in and incorporate as much outside knowledge as we can find. So in the present example, if I really cared about whether I should bring a jacket, then I could reach over to my phone right now and check the weather. And that weather report is going to provide me more useful information than anything that I've listed off on this slide. Nothing really matters as much as whether or not a storm is coming. There's also one thing on this slide that I have not discussed yet. It's an orange square way over to the left, and that's heuristics. Heuristics are these preloaded, emotionally driven shortcut rules. They bypass the whole reasoning process altogether and give you a quick decision. You don't have to think about anything. You don't have to engage in any of this reasoning. You just get a decision. When your mood is poor or you're tired and you do not have the resources for thorough reasoning, heuristics and emotions are what takes over. Also, when we're running on autopilot, heuristics are largely driving what we're doing. They're how we end up driving to work without realizing that we weren't consciously driving the entire time. So the value in heuristics is that it allows our brains to rest a little bit, because all of this reasoning and decision making is rather taxing. And these heuristics work mostly unconsciously. Another benefit of them is that they help us sense and avoid danger before we are fully conscious of it. We need to talk about the negative sides of heuristics, though. Heuristics are often wrong. And they have many different manifestations. One example here is that we tend to think of something as more common if we can imagine it happening. We also ignore our own losses in life. We overestimate our own successes. We often blame other people for their actions while also excusing our own actions on circumstances. This is, if you've ever thought about a behavior that you have performed as compared to a behavior that somebody else has performed, you're much more likely to blame them for what they did and blame whatever was happening to you for whatever you did, whether it's a good or a bad behavior. In sum, we are a mess of little heuristics that are waiting to jump in whenever we aren't paying attention. Lots of different things, and it is worth noting that within this heuristic space is also all of our ignorances. It's also our racism and our sexism and any other snap judgment that you make about another person before you have the chance to stop yourself. All of these things are in that heuristic space because the heuristic's job is to take the burden of thinking off of your brain. So it is important for me to say that reasoning and decision making relies on your capacity to control your own attention, to maintain control of what your brain is doing. And attention is a limited resource. Attention is also the ability to choose and concentrate on relevant stimuli. Our senses are constantly bombarded with information. Like if you tune into your ears, you are hearing something right now, you are smelling something right now, you are seeing something right now, you are feeling things right now. All of this information is coming in at the same time. And attention makes it possible to focus on the relevant information and ignore any irrelevant information. And this also happens faster than conscious thought. In cognitive psychology, we like to break out attention into 6 different skills that we can use to direct our attention. Using the term skill loosely here. The first is our physiological arousal. This is how alert we are feeling in the moment. The next ability is our ability to focus, then our ability to maintain attention, then our ability to ignore distractions, our ability to change our focus, and our ability to attend to multiple stimuli at the same time. Now, I know that I have the formal terms here. There won't be a quiz on this, so don't worry about any of that. As we move on to the next slide, just keep in mind there are 6 different sub-processes to attention. Each one's a different skill, and people can be skilled at different things. Listing these out, one of the benefits is that we can look at where this part of attention occurs within the brain. And this actually is a pretty interesting story. Number 1 and 3, our physiological arousal and our ability to maintain attention share a system. It's the reticular activating system. And I'd like you to think for a moment about what this actually means. When 2 things share a system, they also share similar signals, and they tend to work very closely together. Your alertness, your arousal, is also your mood and your ability to control your mood. So your ability to maintain your alertness and maintain your attention are very closely linked together within this system. When it comes to our ability to focus our attention in on one thing and ignore out any distractions, those two also share the same system, which is very cool. It's another interesting implication of how we attend to things. If you spend too much of your energy in that system ignoring things, then it's going to be more difficult for you to devote resources towards focusing on something. Also, one more system that I want to talk about. This is up in the prefrontal region, mostly of the brain. So that means that it involves a lot of conscious thought and a lot of our higher order thinking. But this is the anterior attentional system. And this plays a role in all of the higher order attentional processes: maintaining, ignoring, changing focus, and maintaining multiple things at the same time. If this is the big powerhouse of attention, and it has a hand in maintaining everything outside of just our ability to quickly focus our attention and how alert we're feeling in the moment. Now, again, there won't be a quiz on this. I just wanted to show you that I can hook you up to an EEG cap and measure how much you're paying attention if I want to. Plus, I can look at it with nuance. I would know if you're paying attention to more than one thing at the same time. I would know if you're attending to more than one type of stimuli at the same time, and so much more. But I do need to mention that our true attentional span is actually very limited. So it seems to have all this complexity here, but our capacity for divided attention, number 6 here, is maybe 2 things. But there's debate over whether we have a capacity for divided attention in the first place, or whether our brains are engaging in alternating attention so quickly that it seems to us that we have the ability to divide our attention between multiple things. We automatically ignore any senses that aren't communicating new information. So every one of our senses has a built-in rapid adapter that lets us tune out the background. When I went through the senses earlier, I'm sure that you were checking in with your senses as we went, but you're not going to be paying attention to the temperature of the room unless the temperature of the room changes or I mention it. And that's all attention. Attention is just, we don't need to think about temperature any longer. It's not changing, it's already fine. And so that is really what attention is doing. It works very fast, but it has very little storage. And so it's constantly pushing things out. Now, the way we get around this small storage idea is that we supplement our attentional scope with our working memory capacity. Working memory has its own limitations. So if attentional scope is like a CPU, virtually no storage whatsoever, but it's running fast, or a graphics card for that matter. Working memory is like your computer RAM. It has a moderate amount of storage. It's storage that gets wiped pretty quickly. And it has a moderate amount of processing capacity. It's a nice middle ground between your perceptual scope, your attention, and your long-term memory, which is like hard drive storage that takes a long time to access and manipulate. So we keep this working memory thing right next to our attentional scope. And this has a capacity of about 7 plus or minus 2 things. This is an important take-home message. If you need somebody to remember a grocery list and you're going to list it off to them, Do not go beyond 7 items. They will forget something. Long-term memory, on the other hand, has a capacity that we have not been able to measure the end of yet, but it is incredibly slow to access. So encoding your thoughts, storing them, updating them, retrieving them, decoding them, all of these processes require time. And so your brain is actually always engaging in long-term memory processes, even when you sleep. And that part about updating your memories, sometimes that occurs in your dreams, and sometimes it occurs when you pull your memories back up again to discuss them. And there are all sorts of interesting implications for how our memories can change over time through this updating process. Now, most people's conscious thoughts are also encoded in whatever language they speak. This has interesting implications for multilinguals. These people maintain more than one language simultaneously, and so their thoughts also can occur in more than one language simultaneously, or the same sentence inside their head will start off in one language and end in a different. Now, when you speak in any language other than your dominant language, you have to re-encode your message into that language. It requires effort. If I'm going to say something in Spanish or in French, then I have to think about what those words would be in the structure of that sentence before I say that message. And that would be a re-encoding of my English message into that language. Now, we would think that multilinguals have to engage in this re-encoding all the time. And that through that process, it should slow down their ability to think, read, write, and problem solve. But for some reason, multilinguals still seem to think, read, write, and problem solve at the same speed as monolinguals. And this was a big controversy in the 90s and the aughts, and the debate is still ongoing over whether multilinguals, because of learning and maintaining multiple languages, if multilinguals have a special ability, increased processing speed over monolinguals. But hundreds, if not thousands, of studies into this line of research, the debate is still ongoing. One thing to note about human languages is that all of them are communicative. They are used to share ideas between people. They're structured so that everyone knows the rules. They're arbitrary because we have no better option. They're dynamic, meaning that they change over time. And this is something that I think a lot of people are familiar with different slang terms entering the English language. Because those terms have a usefulness. Our language changes over time. And most importantly, human language is a generative system of perception sharing. It's a way of one animal sharing something with another animal, either their perspective on something in the world, their thoughts, their imaginations, or some sort of business that they want to engage in with that other person. To close out, we'll talk about some applications here real briefly. But I do want to perform a quick mental check-in. We covered the cognitive revolution. We talked about cognition broadly, and then we talked about a bunch of cognitive processes. Again, cognitive psychology is the study of our thoughts or our cognitions. So one of the biggest applications of cognitive psychology is within the therapy setting. And you can call these different therapy approaches cognitive psychotherapy. Again, cognitive psychology is all about thinking And so cognitive psychotherapy approaches are all about identifying problems in your thought patterns or your thinking approaches. And in the process of applying this research towards therapy, we've come across many different effective treatments for anxiety and mood disorders. Now, the most effective treatment, and it's the most popular cognitive therapy, is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And it pops up in therapy sessions very, very often because it is useful at identifying, let me see. It is effective at helping the patient quickly identify and cope with any specific challenges that are going on. It generally requires fewer sessions than other types of talk therapy, and the structure of this therapy helps keep the therapist on track as they quickly figure out whatever the root of whatever the problem is. It's used to manage anxiety and depression, teach coping skills for stressful situations, identify ways to manage emotions, teach effective communication skills, cope with grief or loss, and overcome trauma. And it is a leading treatment for depression disorders, anxiety disorders, phobias, PTSD, sleep disorders, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, substance use disorders, schizophrenia, and most sexual disorders. In general, it's a really good multi-purpose tool for figuring out what's going on with your client. Cognitive psychology also, because we talk about the way that people think, has many different applications for testing, training, and human capacity. Thanks to the work of cognitive psychologists, our tests, especially our intellectual tests, have moved away from an extremely biased system towards a system that is much less biased these days, because the things that we are measuring are actual skills in the human brain now, rather than just what people are guessing is a skill. And that is the major contribution of cognitive psychology to testing. But cognitive psychologists perform a lot of tests as well. And in the process, we have pretty well outlined the full capacity of memory and the different abilities that our brain has when it's engaging in like reasoning and problem solving, like we discussed before. And then this also has had a major impact on the American classroom and the curriculum, because cognitive psychology has also had an influence on policy and law over the years. In this conversation, we also have talked about AI a few different times. And I did mention once that cognitive psychologists had a big role in helping to develop the original AI code of ethics. And this is how we ended up with all these handy computer metaphors when we're describing things. And I hope that I was able to keep those to a minimum for this conversation. But by uncovering the inner workings of our thoughts, cognitive psychologists have additionally improved negotiation, like as a field in America, and made our American negotiators that much more skilled. And cognitive psychologists often serve as experts in trials, especially whenever we're talking about eyewitness testimony, the fallibility of memory, or how limited our attention is, things along those lines. And something that I mentioned earlier is that this cognitive revolution changed the way that psychologists view human beings. And in turn, it had an impact on how our culture views human beings as well. And so to close out today's discussion, I want to check in with you all. see how we're feeling about this term cognitive psychology and the related term cognition. And we can discuss that as we move forward. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Now, here we are. Am I still sharing screen? Oh, shoot.
Yes, we see your daughter.
Oh, yeah, she's a cutie. Let's see, share.
You know, I do have a question. 1 second. I lost your image. I do have a question. You mentioned something that really caught my interest when you were talking about sort of re-encoding of different languages for multilingual people. And, you know, I always think about context. You know, my area is biopsychology, but, you know, I was at University of Iowa and I worked with a lot of people who were into learning theories. And so to me, the context is really critical. And so what I find is when I'm at home, immersed in that context with my parents, and my mother only speaks Spanish, I actually process in Spanish. But when I'm in the middle of Ohio, I'm always processing in English. And let's say someone who speaks Spanish comes to me, it actually takes a second or so for me to process it, convert it in my brain, and then spit out whatever I'm going to say in Spanish. And so I agree with you in that sense that, you know, we think about attention the same way that people talk about selective attention or multitasking. The reality is that people don't multitask, they switch tasks. And it's almost the same thing with language, right? So that if I'm thinking in English, I'm thinking in English and only processing in English. But if I'm in a different environment, that context within that framework within my cognition changes as well to reflect that I'm in a different context, and then I process in that language. Now, Umesh, you could probably help us out on this. I don't know how other people process that information in different languages. I'm presuming people do the same thing. I've never heard of someone who can think and process at the same time. So it's really curious in terms of what, you know, based on what you were saying.
Oh, yeah. Like, there's a conscious side of it and there's an unconscious side of it. And you're definitely talking about your mind adapting to whatever the context is, and it's preparing you in like your optimal fashion, right? To speak English in the English speaking context and Spanish in the Spanish speaking context. Yeah, and that's super interesting. When I was speaking about simultaneously maintaining these languages, I'm mostly talking about when you have 1 foot in one context and 1 foot in the other context. These are more rare situations. But yeah, I would agree with you that the general feeling is that at least in the context that you're finding yourself in right now, where there is a very clear distinction between your English-speaking world and your Spanish-speaking world, then it's probably really easy for your brain to just jump from English-speaking me to Spanish-speaking me, right?
I would also imagine it'd be an interesting study to look at people who do professional translations, who have to switch tasks, switch languages, you know, within a dime. They have to turn, they have to spend, especially if it's live translations. Because, you know, there is that thing that has to happen. You know, someone may talk to me in Spanish, but that processing has to happen, especially if I have to translate into a different language.
Yeah. Yeah, I do not know how you do it, Edison. I am a monolingual, and in my graduate cognitive psych class, I did my paper on the bilingual advantage, looking into this because it's impressive the things that multilinguals can do. You might not even know that your brains run. It seems to be running a little bit faster than the monolinguals.
I know there's been a number of studies looking at vocabulary, and the argument was multilinguals would have 2 sets of vocabulary, right? That you have this immense vocabulary because those in two different languages. But then the reality is that there's some limitations to that. If your vocabulary is 100 words, that would be split, and not necessarily 50-50, but it would be split across those two languages, as opposed to, again, this immense list of vocabulary terms.
Yeah. See, I'm not familiar with that line of work. Would you feel that you have fewer words in your lexicon than a monolingual?
I think to some degree, yes. You know, and of course, understanding Latin and root words does help, but there are some limitations. There are certain words that you know. There's also the idea of expression, right? So there's certain words in Spanish that have no expression that can't be expressed in terms of English, and so there's that aspect of it. That not all words translate, but definitely. You know, it's an interesting idea. I think it's an interesting topic to think about. Is my vocabulary limited, and in what language? I'm primarily English speaking when I'm in the current context, so my vocabulary is greater in English. But when I move into the other context, there is a shift. Again, it's almost like I'm using a whole totally different dictionary because the words are different, the expressions are different, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, a whole different system of language as well. But, okay, so you are a biopsychologist. I'm a social psychologist by training. I'm trying not to talk about environmental influences on things. I'm trying to sell myself as a cognitive psychologist right now.
Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Sanders. I will be meeting with you at 2:00 Eastern Time, right? And so looking forward to that interview. Thanks again for your interest and for that very informative presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed.
Yes, thank you so much.
Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, well, thank you everyone who's here. Are we also joining the next teaching demo with the political science candidate? That one is at 11. Let's see who.